Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm very proud to be the founder of campaign group Transparency Task Force. We are an international collaborative community dedicated to the idea that the financial services sector is profoundly important to society, but that it also has a high predisposition to misbehave if it's allowed to. We are very the concept of transparency. We believe that transparency has a positive force on people's behavior and conduct. Of course, there's nothing new in that thinking. It can go back at least until 1914 when Justice Louis Brandeis, the US justice, wrote his book about banks and the abuse of the banks. In that book in 1914, he coined the phrase "sunlight is best disinfectant." I do believe that to be true. I do believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Our efforts within the Transparency Task Force to drive change, positive progressive change into the financial industry is built around the idea that if we can expose what is going on, it will lead to improvements in behavior. People are less likely to do bad things if they think they're going to get caught, and they're more likely to get caught if what they're doing is exposed and brought out into the open, if we can get it out of the shadows. So there's therefore a very natural alignment, a very authentic and natural alignment between the work of the Transparency Task Force, which is all about exposing things happening that shouldn't be happening, and the work of investigative reporters. We are friendly with the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And one of its members, one of its participants is here with us tonight. We have Frederick Obermeyer, who I'm extremely proud to be introducing you all to this evening. Frederick and his colleagues, as you will be here, played an absolutely epicentral role in bringing us the Panama Papers, which, as you already will all know, led to massive shockwaves through the system, really, really helping to make it possible for people to see how the rich and powerful hide the money. Powerful stuff. Let me tell you a little bit more about Frederick. Frederick worked with Bastian Obermeyer. They founded the Munich-based investigative newsroom Paper Trail Media. Together with Bastian, he initiated the Panama Papers, also Bahamas Leaks, Paradise Papers investigations. He has received, quite rightly so, he has received numerous honors for his work, including, listen to this, folks, the CNN Award, the Otto Brenner Prize, the renowned Wachter Prize, the Henri Nannen Prize, the Reporter Prize, and the Helmut Schmidt Journalisten Prize. He also shared in joint awards with his ICIJ colleagues, including the Scripps Howard Awards, the George Polk Award for Business Reporting, the Bartlett and Steele Award, the Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, and the Pulitzer Prize 2017 for explanatory reporting. In 2017, he was also further awarded the Murray Fellowship in Watchdog Journalism at the Niemeyer Foundation at Harvard University. Frederick is co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. What a great concept. The Anti-Corruption Data Collective. And he's the author of several books, including best-selling accounts of the so-called Ibiza affair, which led to snap elections in Austria, as well as the Panama Papers. The book entitled The Panama Papers, breaking the story of how the rich and powerful hide the money. Frederick, I can honestly tell you that we have had many, many journalists come and speak to us at these events, helping to shine a light on all kinds of issues. With the greatest respect to them, I think you are the most honored and the most awarded individual we have ever had at one of our book club events. I am and forever will be very grateful to you for setting aside some time to speak with us this evening, Frederick. We can't wait to hear what you want to tell us about the book and the background and its consequences. Tell us as much as you can about anything you're working on at the moment, whilst, of course, we understand fully that some things must remain secret. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a great crowd this evening from various parts of the world. We are really fortunate to have Frederick with us talking about his book and related matters. Before we do anything else, can we please show our appreciation, not just to Frederick for being here, but also to the work that he's done over many years with his colleagues, applying that concept of sunlight is the best disinfectant, the way that true, proper investigative journalists can. We believe that investigative journalists like Frederick and his colleagues are an engine for truth and transparency and accountability. We would be at a loss without them. We salute you. We salute and respect your work, Frederick, and the work of your colleagues. And we are very, very pleased and happy that you're here tonight talking with us. Let's show our appreciation, folks. Frederick, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you. Absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Over to you, sir, to take it from there. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you very much.
Wow, thanks a lot for that introduction. You see me blushing, so thank you for having me. It's an honor for me to talk about the Panama Papers from the beginning till today. So I hope you brought some time with you. Nevertheless, I have brought a short presentation, but don't worry, I will make it short. It's only like for illustrational reasons, because then you can see at least some of the original documents that we found. I would love to bring you back to where it all started. It started with a message, an encrypted message that my colleague Bastian Obermeier, who is, just for the record, not my brother, received from a source calling him or herself John Doe, and asked us if we were interested in data. And of course, this is something, as an investigative journalist, you always say yes. And then you look at the data and then you decide if it's of public interest, if it's authentic, if you want to continue. But what we saw here after we said yes, that was really like big. And because we saw that the source basically gave us 2.6 terabyte of data of a law firm called Mossack Fonseca in Panama City. At that point in time, it was, at least in Germany, not known that much. There, if you Googled Mossack Fonseca at that point in time, you could find one article of an American journalist basically saying that there's rumors that this law firm catered autocrats and organized crime figures, but there was no proof. But for us, we already had stumbled across one company that was founded by Mossack Fonseca. So we thought like, wow, maybe we could like find the missing piece of the puzzle for that story in the data. But of course, we were proven wrong, because we were not finding only one piece of the puzzle, but we were finding thousands of puzzles that we had to put together. The two guys here that you see are the two individuals that gave their name to the law firm, the founders. On the upper part of here, you see Mr. Mossack, who was born in Germany and moved to Panama quite soon, and Mr. Ramon Fonseca, who passed away, so he's not alive anymore. So where it started? It started when I was, and my colleague Bastian, you see him here in a picture. We worked for Süddeutsche Zeitung at that point in time. That's a Munich-based newspaper. I think in the UK, you would compare it with The Guardian. So like for where it stood and what its renommee, at least in the country, was. So we started there to investigate and to dig into the data. But we were quite junior. You can see it in the picture. There's no gray hair. Now there's a lot of gray hair. So we were overwhelmed by investigating and clicking through 2.6 terabyte of data. There was data on more than 100,000 of companies. But we pretty soon realized that there's a lot of stories of public interest in there, because we stumbled across heads of state, heads of government, organized crime figures, the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, the best friend of Vladimir Putin. So we soon realized there is a lot of stories in there, stories of public interest, of potential sanctions busting, of potential tax evasion, of potential corruption. So we pretty soon also realized that this is not only German stories. This is not only European stories. This is not only stories about the global north. It's stories about basically every country on this earth. So we decided to share the data. Already at that point in time, we were members of the ICAJ. That's basically an association of investigative journalists who team up for global investigations. And we convinced them to dig through the data together with us. So here you see one picture of one of those meetings where we met. We had several meetings, one in Washington, one in London, one in Munich, to basically divide work, share what we have found, and decide upon next steps. To give you an impression what the league consisted of and what its size was at that point in time, that you already tells you a little bit how overwhelmed we were. At that point in time, journalists were used to work with gigabytes of data. So the WikiLeaks Cablegate data was 1.7 gigabytes. Offshore leaks of that was also leaked to the ICAJ was 260 gigabytes of data. And here you see in comparison the Panama Papers, and you can imagine how shocked we were that we wanted to basically dig through all this data. You could also see here the file types. It was millions of emails. It was millions of PDFs. It was a lot of images. The images were mostly like scanned documents. We had text documents and other database formats. So we basically found a way of OCRing this data, so making it searchable, so that we then had a search engine similar to Google, where you could basically search in the data, and we then cross-matched the data, for example, with sanctions lists, with lists of current and former heads of state, members of parliament, prominent figures. We found, for example, Leo Messi in the data, what was at that point in time still a very good soccer player. Some say he still is. My kid says no, but that's another question. This is also some of the original documents to get you an impression, like handwritten stuff, those certificates of incorporation, but it was also emails. And the emails were the crucial part for us, because as you all know, if you set up a company, for example, in the BVI or Panama, you can, of course, set up or use nominee directors. Sometimes you even you can use bearer shares where you don't even have to put the actual shareholder in writing. So for us, the emails were the important part, because in those emails, the Mossack Fonseca guys spoke about who the ultimate beneficial owner basically is, even if it was like hidden via bearer shares, nominee directors, or other tricks. So what we then found was around about 70 leads to heads of state and heads of government. Here you see some of them. And it took us more than a year actually from the point in time when we first received the data till when we planned to publish in April 2016. Planned because we made one mistake. We, together with all our partners, had agreed on one date and what time when we wanted to publish. But it was, and that's a little bit embarrassing for us at Süddeutsche. We had set up a special homepage, a landing page for the Panama Papers. And we were told that we have to test it a little bit before, some minutes before the official testing date. And our IT specialist told us that nobody will ever find that we are testing it. So we said yes, but there was one person who found it, and that was Edward Snowden. Well, he's a trained intelligence guy. He found the URL, and even before, 12 minutes before we wanted to launch, he basically tweeted it out to the world. And that was basically the beginning of, well, worldwide news, and our servers at Süddeutsche Zeitung even breaking down for several minutes because it was so many people trying to access what was in the Panama Papers. I think one of the most illustrative cases was the Prime Minister of Iceland, who was in the data, Sigmundur David Gunnlaugsson. He was in the data with a company that was called Wintris, that he had not made transparent or declared to the public. Also, there was such a demand in Iceland. In Iceland, if you're prime minister, you have to declare all the companies you have shares in. He didn't. And some of our Nordic partners asked him for an interview. And during this interview, they then had the question like, well, what can you tell us about Wintris? And if you have time today after this talk, search for that interview on YouTube, because it's amazing. You can see him really like dropping his face and like, what? And then he's standing up and leaving the interview. You can really see how shocked he was that journalists have learned about his company. Shortly after we published the story, there was mass demonstrations, not only in Iceland. In Iceland, it was the biggest demonstrations in history, but also in other countries like Argentina, in Malta, in London. So that was for us when we realized that this story really reached the world and not only a small audience of our quite small newspaper at that point in time. It was hundreds of investigations that have been launched, and there was also a huge backlash. One of the countries where there was a huge backlash, that was Panama. So from one day to another, I had thousands of followers from Panama, from Pakistan on my Twitter account, and I didn't realize what happened. And there was a lot of like haters, like really sending me ugly messages. And I realized that it was of the family of the head of government at the time. He was, and his family were implicated in the Panama Papers. And pretty soon there was an investigation launched. And they brought up a document proving us wrong and proving, I say proving here like that, because it was proven, the proof was written in Calibri. And it was allegedly a document that was dated before 2007. That is important here because we later learned from the investigators in Pakistan, that became known as the Font Gate, that Calibri was not used before 2007. So that was basically the proof that the document that they provided to prove us wrong was falsified. Till today, the Panama Papers led to governments and authorities recouping around about $2 billion. That's only a rough estimation because it's always hard to say which or how important the Panama Papers were for this and that investigation. It was hundreds, I would even say thousands of investigations worldwide. There was indictments in the US and Germany and many, many other countries. There was Panama Papers laws passed in many countries. In Germany, there was the Panama Papers law was originally designed to introduce a public UBO register in Germany. What we then got was a UBO register, but not one that was public. But that's another thing I wanted to speak later about. And Mossack Fonseca was closed. So the law firm that did not only have their headquarters in Panama, but dozens of branches all around the world, among others, for example, in Luxembourg and in Switzerland, they closed down. And there's currently still international arrest warrants for some of their key personnel. Here's some of the headlines coming out from the Panama Papers. Here you see Iceland Prime Minister Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson stepping down, a Spanish minister resigning, the Israeli businessman Benny Steinmetz was convicted of corruption for stories that we uncovered in the Panama Papers. Well, and Mossack Fonseca shut down. But there's also like some impact that I'm not proud of. But I think it's always, when we speak about the Panama Papers, it's not only about the good side of the Panama Papers. We also have to speak about the bad side. That according to the Reuters Institute, in 17% of the tracked countries, there have been backlash against journalists who covered the Panama Papers. For our colleagues in Panama, for example, there was on social media like a little survey where you could click, do you wish those journalists to be put in prison, or shall we simply dump them in the Bay of Panama? So you can get an idea of how the reaction was in Panama itself. Some of our colleagues in Russia had to leave the country due to their reporting on Putin's friends that have been implied in the Panama Papers. And the worst cases are our colleagues Daphne and Jan, Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, who did not originally work on the Panama Papers, but on the fallout. She was killed in a car bombing, and our colleague Jan Kuciak and his fiancée were also killed. They were also, or he was also working on Panama Papers cases. So for me, this is a constant reminder, and also a driving force for future investigations to basically prove that those individuals who killed them will not stop other journalists from reporting. Quite recently, that was last year, finally, the Panama Papers trial took place in Panama. In Panama, the tax haven, the founders and some of the key personnel had to face justice. In my opinion, unfortunately, they've been all acquitted. I think it was not the best time for justice in Panama, because you could see that basically the persecutors did only use those cases that other countries had already investigated, and did not really use what they themselves had found, because they had raided the Mossack Fonseca offices. They had truckloads full of paper. They had the server copies, and still they claimed that they did not have enough proof, and that they could not prove that all the proof that was already out there is authentic. So I think that's a shame, but I did not expect anything else, to be honest, from Panama, because Panama was and is still a country that is earning a lot of money from its secrecy jurisdiction status. But still, even today, there's international arrest warrants against at least two Mossack Fonseca managers. That's against Jürgen Mossack and one Swiss manager called Zollinger. So they cannot travel. Mr. Zollinger is basically trapped in Switzerland, and Mr. Mossack is trapped in Panama. As soon as they leave the country, they have to expect to be arrested and face trial. In Germany, they're indicted in absentia for founding a criminal organization. So that's basically an allegation that is normally used for organized crime groups as the Mafia, the 'Ndrangheta, and other groups. So we will see if they ever have to face justice in Germany, but I think it would be a good thing. But also, the Panama Papers are already an old story, and I told Andy before we started that it feels a little bit about like my grandparents speaking about the time when the time before they had color TV. It's me speaking about the Panama Papers, but still, the Panama Papers are still an ongoing investigation. You will not read that many articles anymore where you can see, like, as you can see in the Panama Papers, because there's something that many colleagues are tired of, me as well. But still, there is investigations where Panama Papers data is used. And this is one of them, when some colleagues of mine and I think it was last year, proved that German fighter pilots are or have been hired by the Chinese military to basically use their knowledge on Western strategy, on Western fighter jets to train the Chinese. And the Panama Papers came into play because we found out which companies were basically used to pay those pilots. Those companies were in the Panama Papers. So we basically only had to look up for the companies who the beneficiaries are. And there we already had one trace to some of those pilots. And there's many, many other stories where colleagues of mine are still, like, on a daily basis, actually, searching for hints and traces in the Panama Papers. So for me, whenever I start a new investigation, you normally, as a journalist, you Google. And the second step for me is I search in the Panama Papers. And in many, many cases, and more than I would ever have expected, you still find leads in there. And that is what makes me happy, because it shows how long-lasting such a gift that was given to us by a brave whistleblower can have an impact. But still, I mean, that was one of the leading questions, I think, that I wanted to bring here. Like, what now? I mean, it's 9 years after the Panama Papers have been published. And I think we're still facing the same discussions as in that time. I think the Panama Papers led to a good discussion because it was a discussion for the general public. I think when we spoke about nominee directors, shell companies, the implications for the financial industry, I think all of that was not a secret in the industry, but for the general public, it was a secret. They didn't understand it. And the Panama Papers brought this discussion in like general terms. You can find like rap songs, rock songs on the Panama Papers. You can find a Netflix movie made by Soderbergh on the Panama Papers. And it's all about shell company, about illicit money flows. And I think that's good because it tells you that the discussion about transparency, about the fight for more transparency, the fight for more accountability has reached a global general public. If you ask the friends of my kids, they don't know exactly what the Panama Papers were, but they know that it's about shell companies and it's about crooks. And I think that's good. When even children and teenagers know what it's about, that tells you that we have reached at least some audience. But still, I see several shortcomings. After the Panama Papers, at least in Europe, there was a lot of like politicians, high-ranking politicians, members of governments stepping out and asking for public UBO registers. We got some of them in some countries, but in the European Union, we got UBO registers, but not public UBO registers. In Germany, as a journalist, you can enter those databases, but you always have to prove that you're a journalist and what your investigation is about. I think that's a shortcoming because we should not underestimate the power of the public, of advocacy groups, of journalists, of other nonprofits. If you would open this information to the public, I think you would win a lot. I think there's a price to pay, especially in Germany. We are very cautious when it comes to privacy and data protection. But for example, I'm a company owner. I own a company. It's Paper Trail Media. You can go in the register. You will see how much money I invested in the company, how much we are earning every year, and that's good. I think I have nothing to hide. And I think that when it comes to companies, there are more advantages of making this open to the public than there are disadvantages. In Germany, we always have the argument of the hidden champions, the millionaires that own companies that are not so well known, at least they're not attached to their family names. And those companies are always their lobby organizations arguing that having public UBO registers would put their families in danger, that there would be a risk of kidnapping. And whenever I ask those lobby groups, like, give me one example, give me only one example. I mean, there is countries where you have public UBO registers. Go there and tell me one example where one of those kidnapping cases was related to public UBO registers. So far, I did not receive even one of those examples. That tells you also a lot. So that's why I personally think we need those public UBO registers. And especially when it comes to these days, I mean, at least here in Germany, the news is currently all about Trumps, about oligarchy, oligarchs in Russia, oligarchs in the USA. And I think we have to be ready and resilient for basically standing up against those oligarchs. And I think getting public UBO registers in place would be one first step to be resilient. Another step would be public real estate registers. Wherever you got them, for example, when France opened up a real estate register, immediately you had journalists, you had investigators combing through these registers and finding a lot of sanctioned individuals, oligarchs, still owning real estate. So I think that would also be an important step. If I can dream, I would wish for more transparency when it comes to trusts and foundations. If you look in the European sanctions regime imposed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there was many oligarchs that have been mentioned in the Panama Papers being sanctioned, and still some of them are active in Europe. They're saying like it's not them, it's only their trusts, and they're detached from their trusts. But you can see, like, if you're looking in the small print and on their activities, you can feel how they're still controlling those trusts. I think also that we are still lacking proper asset disclosure rules. For example, in Germany, we have an upcoming election. And just basically out of interest, me and my colleagues, we asked all of those candidates if they are owning shares in companies. And in Germany, if you're a member of parliament, you only have to disclose it if you're owning more than 5% of shares of a company. You can imagine, just imagine owning 4.9% of Tesla. Well, you're a rich man. I would say, like, wow, congrats, you can retire. And still you would not have to disclose it as a member of parliament. If you're a member of the government in Germany, you're not even allowed to do, for example, unpaid work for the Red Cross. That's not allowed. But you can still have 4.9% of shares of a company. The public will never be able to check if what they are doing in government, if their acts of governing Germany will have an influence on their shares. And I think that's a scandal. That should be changed. In this case, France is another good example how one could be more transparent without doing harm. I mean, you can look up what Mr. Macron, which shares he's owning. And that's good. I think we should have such laws in place in every country. And I think we should even look more, and I think especially in this group, it's important about the role and the responsibility of the enablers. And the enablers are mostly in the financial service industry. There is, in my opinion, a huge responsibility. I know that in the financial service industry, there's lots of people who raise the alarm bells. When they see red flags, they're sending suspicious activity reports. But there's also at the same time many cases where this does not happen, where individuals are helping crooks and criminals to basically hide their money, not only from the tax authorities, but also from authorities in general. And I don't believe that they're not aware of what they're doing, because I have seen so many examples, among others in the Panama Papers, that those individuals are well aware of what they're doing. For example, in the Panama Papers, we had one case where one of the founders of Mossack Fonseca was in an email chain where some managers discussed if they should keep the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, who was sanctioned already, who was known to be a financier of the civil war in Syria, if they should keep him as a customer. And they kept him. The argument was, well, we know a Western bank who also kept them, so let's keep him. I think that's not responsible activities for financial service providers. And that is, I think, that's not my words, that's Mr. Obama. And I think when I first read that quote of him that he said shortly after the Panama Papers, I was angry, because I think a lot of the stuff that we are seeing in the Panama Papers is already illegal. But of course, he was right. There's also a lot of stuff in there that is dubious, that is questionable, but it is unfortunately still legal. And I think we have to fight both parts of this equation. We have to fight the illegal stuff. We have to uncover it. We have to hope for authorities to go after the crooks and criminals as soon as we as journalists reveal something. But I think there's also a duty for society, and especially for lawmakers, to change laws to make dubious and questionable behavior that is still legal, to make it illegal in the future. Thank you.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic, Frederick. Thank you so much. Thank you. Can we once again show our appreciation to Frederick before we open things up to take us to the conversation part of our evening? Excuse me. I'm just going to stop the sharing. Okay. I have so many questions. I could hog the conversation with you for the rest of the evening, Frederick, but I'm not going to do that. But allow me, if I may, to ask a few. John Doe. Let's go back to John Doe. You described this person as a brave whistleblower, but clearly a very brave whistleblower. Do you have any understanding or any feelings as to why, of all the people he could have approached, he approached you and your colleagues? Any thoughts about that?
I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of guesses. I think I have a theory,
Tell
and
us.
that is based on some facts that I have learned from John Doe. Some of those facts are that he or she, let's call it them, had
Yes.
approached other outlets as well, among others, very well-known newspapers in the US, among others, WikiLeaks,
Wow.
and they did not properly respond. So imagine you were a whistleblower who had already approached the big players, and they did not respond or react properly, did not show interest. Then you might think about like, wow, Mossack Fonseca has one German owner. So let's go search for German journalists. And at that point in time, if you searched or Googled German journalists who have worked on tax havens before, I would say there was a little bit more than a handful. And two of them were Bastian and me. And so I think we were simply the lucky ones, that maybe we have been the only ones that have approached, but I would not rule out that others have been approached as well. And I think it's also part of the reality and of the truth that we had time. And I think that also made a difference. At that point in time, we were, me more than my colleague Bastian, were very junior journalists. We were not like the beat reporters that came to work and knew like, as soon as you sit down at your desk, you're working 10 hours and then you're leaving and you have no time to eat, no time to grab a coffee. We did already work on investigations, but we were not on the daily beat. So we had time to look and read into documents that were leaked to us. And I think that was a huge advantage. If I imagine this happening at a later stage, I'm not sure if I had enough time to read and understand the importance of those documents. So that is also something that within my team. So I'm lucky that it's not only me and Bastian reading and analyzing anymore what whistleblowers and sources are sending us, but we have a team of more than a dozen of researchers now. And my message is always take your time, read what you get, ask questions, and try to understand stuff. Don't put it away too fast because you could get the next Panama Papers.
Yes. Yes. Very good indeed. And whilst John Doe will obviously have understood that what he or she shared with you was going to be significant, do you think John Doe realized just how significant it was going to be? Would it have even blown his own mind, his or her own mind, sorry, about just how
I,
significant the Panama Papers were going to be?
I think them were well aware of like the scope that of stories that have been covered by the documents. But I think in the end, John Doe also was surprised on how big the reporting was. And I think also, I must say here, because you never know if John Doe watches this afterwards, I think imagining to be John Doe, a whistleblower, knowing what you're risking, and then having journalists in Germany who are telling you like, well, we are working with the data you provided, but it will take us several months. That was a lot of trust that he put in us. And there was, of course, moments where John Doe was impatient, like, why aren't you faster? But I think, and that's what I've heard afterwards from John Doe, that then was quite happy to see the outcome afterwards, to see what them have reached by blowing the whistle. So, and that is also like a good signal, in my opinion, for potential whistleblowers. John Doe has proven that one can blow the whistle, initiate an international investigation, initiate a revelation by journalists, thereby causing hundreds of investigations all around the world, and still staying safe and anonymous. So that is a good sign, and that proof or has proven that whistleblowers can blow the whistle without basically risking and ruining their whole life.
So this leads me on to my final question before we open it up to others. I'm not really sure how to frame this question, but bear with me. So Julian Assange, what happened to him was, of course, very different to what happened to John Doe. Why? Why did Julian Assange end up with the life experience he had compared to what happened to John Doe? What were the fundamental differences?
I think the major difference is I do not consider Assange as a whistleblower himself. He was a publisher who worked with the material that brave whistleblowers provided to him. But I think even like if you look to what happened to the whistleblowers that worked with Assange, many of them faced huge repercussions and even ended in jail. And I think one of the reasons was that these whistleblowers did not stay anonymous. And John Doe was very clever. I mean, he did not reveal their identity to Bastian and me. So you could have put a pistol to my head and threatened me and my family, and still I could not have revealed the identity because I didn't know it. And I think that was a very clever decision. And that's also, and I'm hating myself sometimes in the daily work for this recommendation, but my recommendation for whistleblowers is, if possible, stay anonymous, even when communicating with journalists. This makes it for us as journalists by far more difficult, because if you don't know who's on the other end of a communication line, you have to like put a far more double checks, triple checks to the information, because you cannot check the background of the information of the whistleblower, him or herself. But I think for the whistleblower, that's the best advice you can give.
This is so interesting, Frederick. It's so interesting. We have all kinds of rules and regulations in place in the UK that in theory, protect whistleblowers. But we also know so many whistleblowers who have frankly come to regret blowing the whistle because they've been harmed so badly as a consequence of sharing what they wanted to share in the public interest. In the UK, many whistleblowers have been treated very, very badly. I am ashamed to tell you. And it's also very frustrating when, for example, a whistleblower reports to a regulator that there is a fraud taking place and the regulator doesn't act on it. This is a pattern that we are seeing time and time again, where the authorities that are supposed to launch into action to protect the public interest fail to do so for one reason or another. There is a very significant degree of disappointment in the system, distrust in the system, anger towards the system because it is failing to protect the interests of whistleblowers. Again, I thank you for such an interesting conversation, Frederick. Folks, I've got lots more questions I'll ask Frederick if the opportunity arises, but let me not hog Frederick's time and attention. Please do raise your hand if you'd like to come in with a comment, an observation, a question, an idea, whatever you like. We are non-prescriptive here. Let's have a conversation amongst us. I see that Mr. Mark Bannister has raised his hand. Mark, go for it. Thank you. And I'll tell you what, Mark, just to give Frederick some context, talk very, very briefly about your background so he knows where you're coming from. Very briefly, thank you.
I once upon a time was in banking. I'm certainly not a whistleblower, but I've learned a little bit about it, etc. But Frederick, I wanted to ask you, by the way, thank you on behalf of everybody for a most illuminating overview of what happened. I can only imagine that you've cantered across the landscape, if not galloped indeed. But what I wanted to ask you was, do you think that part of your success was your willingness to share the contents of the Panama Papers with the international group of journalists, such that when you finally released it to the world, you did so, and there were many champions of it, so that you were not personally and your colleague personally exposed to it, whereas if you had constrained it, there might have been a temptation by the authorities in Germany or indeed your own newspaper to sit upon you or to curtail it, or you could have become subject to those sorts of pressures. But because it was so broad and the scope was so huge, and it created an unstoppable event, that that never arose. Could you speak to that?
Yes, definitely. I think the Panama Papers have finally proven the power of collaborative journalism. There was collaborative projects before, like offshore leaks, but in newsroom there was, at that point in time, and I was part of offshore leaks, but at that point in time there was still this discussion in newsrooms: why should you share a scoop? And I think there was not always the best explanation why you should do it. But the Panama Papers have given this explanation because everybody wins. And you mentioned some of the parts. The journalists win because they are better protected. If you had done harm to Bastian and me, you could have stopped our investigations, but you could not have stopped the whole team. And I think that's what the bad guys have realized. Doing harm to one journalist always like creates backlash because the other journalists are teaming up together and continuing the work. Then a story is getting bigger because journalists are also, we all have egos. And when it comes to like the owners of newspapers or media outlets, they also have egos and they have interests. But the Panama Papers have proven that if you're sharing, you're getting by far much more back. If I imagine having investigated the Panama Papers with Bastian, or let's even say a team of half a dozen reporters, this would have been a work of 10 years or so. And no media outlet on earth, I'm 100% convinced, would have done it. After half a year, every editor would have told you like, well, stop it. Come on, do you really want to do that story about Burkina Faso? Or that story about Thailand? That's so far away. Let's focus on all the stories in Germany. And I think by sharing it, we had made sure that all those stories are covered by the journalists, by the very journalists who know their country. And on the other hand side, and I think you also hinted on it a little bit, working in a team prevented journalists censoring or leaving away some stuff. I mean, there was cases in the Panama Papers where owners of media outlets who have been part of the Panama Papers have been mentioned in them. Just imagining if it were only those journalists of this very outlet, working on the Panama Papers, and the pressure they would have felt. But the Panama Papers and the group exercise gave them the perfect excuse. They could go to their bosses and say like, hey, we found you, we should report, because if we are not doing it, just imagine if one of the 400 other journalists is finding it, it's super embarrassing for you. This will be a scandal, but you can like save your ass, and pardon my French here, if you make it transparent. Let's report up on the Panama Papers and at the same time mention that you're in there as well. And that's what they have chosen. And I think that is good, because that also like, it's a self-regulating body, because we did not share the Panama Papers in like small country packages and tell the Italian journalists like, hey, you can only look into the Italian part of it. We gave everything to everybody. It's like everybody could investigate the German part, even so that we as the German journalists did it as well. But that was good, because that was also a control function. And I think when speaking about countries of the global south, I mean, let's face the facts how journalism works. Big Western media outlets are not reporting that much about countries in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa. But I think it was super important that those stories have been published as well. And that's the reason why we got many African reporters on board. And they did amazing stories because they could prove how corrupt elites are basically plundering their countries. And I think this would have been like maybe we would have done it in Germany, but it would have been a small story, let's say on page 22 in our newspaper. There, it was page 1. It was like the major news. And I think that's important, that we like, by sharing, you're helping society all over the place. And it's like, I think we as journalists, we have a responsibility. And sometimes media owners are not addressing this responsibility always. But as soon as they realize that they win something as well, they have been fans of this whole collaborative process. And if you look what happened after the Panama Papers, there was the Paradise Papers, Pandora Papers, Vincent File. There was so many collaborative projects. And I think one of the reasons was that editors and owners realized, and publishers, like, they saw the success of the Panama Papers and they wanted to replicate it. And it was for good. It was for us, for society, and for more transparency.
Fantastic. Fantastic question, Mark, and great answer. We're going to go to Paul Birch next. Folks like Paul Birch, raise your hand if you want to come in with a comment or question digitally if you know how to do it, or just wave at me if you don't. Okay, Mr. Paul Birch, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Frederick, for everything that you've shared with us so far. I'm a victim of a huge international pension scam. And you mentioned in your presentation about the assassination of Daphne in Malta and the horrendous effects that has had. And one of the things that I still cannot understand is that the ICIJ also published the Luanda leaks, which again specifically identified Malta as a jurisdiction which is absolutely mired in corruption and malfeasance, and yet the EU must be fully aware of what goes on, and yet it seems to sit back and take no sanctions against that at all. I can't understand why the EU keeps pouring European money into a jurisdiction which is patently corrupt. Have you got a view on that?
Well, yeah, I have a very strong view on it because I share your frustration. I think I do see like similar cases, not only when it comes to Malta. I think we should speak more about Cyprus as well. Yeah. Cyprus, Malta, the role of Luxembourg. Of course, there's not enough pressure there. There's not enough will to change something. And I think it's also, one reason is also that the discussion like fell silent, to be honest. I mean, we are not discussing it in political circles anymore, or that much as it would have been necessary. And that's why I wish, and I do see a need for new publications, bringing this topic up, because we are living in a very challenging time. And I think we are living in a time where we can also see like, which different actors are using tax havens, shell companies, intransparent company structures. If we speak about sanctions, about disinformation campaigns, about corruption, that's about inequality. That's all connected to intransparent company structures, tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions. And I think that connection has not been made enough, in my opinion. And that's also something that I, as a journalist, am frustrated of, that me and my colleagues, we have not been able like to transport this message, that there's a connection. We cannot like view on those different topics detached from each. They're all feeding into the same stuff and the same problem. And this problem is not enough addressed till today.
We're going to come back to this point in a moment. The uncomfortable, awkward, shameful relationship between the jurisdictions themselves and those who are acting in a, let's say, a suboptimal way. But we'll come back to that. I think we saw a hand just now from somebody. It was, forgive me, I can't see everybody in one go on my screen. Admati? Oh, sorry, I can see another hand there.
Anat Admati, is that who you're saying?
Anat Admati, yes, very nice to meet you. Please, you're new to us, so why don't you briefly introduce yourself first of all, then make your point. Thank you.
I am a professor at Stanford Business School. I don't know if there are any academics here, but I've gotten very, very interested in this topic. I'm teaching right now a course here at Stanford called Global Capital Power and Institutions in the Global Economy. And I have a conference coming up that will have specific sessions on money laundering and illicit funds and the need for trustworthy institutions. And I wrote a book about banking, and that led me down the path of the above the law institutions and to digging into cum-ex. You're a German, so you know what I'm talking about. And in my conference, I'm going to have Gerhard Schick, and I have talked to the whistleblower from Netherlands on cum-ex. So I'm very familiar with these issues, and also with whistleblowers on, like, you know, Deutsche Bank accounting scandal in the US and the way the whistleblower the protection works in the US nominally better than Europe, but still not good, and mostly based on, lawyer bounties for rewards, but, still. And so, in a lot of the cases that are, so I want to say two things. First of all, I think Panama Paper got more traction because it was about politicians. It seems as if when it's just a corporate whistleblower, it's not as headline grabbing, maybe, which is a bit of a problem. But of course, that problem also goes to the political system. Why so little is done when a corporate whistleblower, does stuff, unless it directly touches a politician. So some of this stuff that we're talking about, politicians are very responsible for it ultimately in our democracies, but they fail repeatedly. So your frustration is my frustration, all the people probably here who are frustrated. And so as an educator at the Stanford University, I feel that public awareness is really key. And in the conference that I plan to have in early April here, it's going to be open to the public for most of it, except for a roundtable where we will discuss what academics, activists, and media can do about these problems plaguing basically capitalism and democracy. And the conference title is Global Capitalism, Trust and Accountability. And that's really where it is I think that what we need to rethink entirely, and the Panama Papers certainly to this issue, is the corporate person in our democracies. What rights does a corporate person have for secrecy? How we, because the corporate form is usually the way, and the trust is a way in which opacity happens, anonymous corporations, et cetera. There's a battle in the US right now about corporate transparency, beneficial owners. So it really goes to the basics of a corporation. I think people can understand this in the public. We just have to find ways, in my view, to get through with sort of a basic understanding of the role of the way opacity works and the way people are actually impacted by it that they may not quite see. I think right now, because the US just has this week Donald Trump come to presidency, there is more interest here in cronyism and things like that. I saw it just now. I'm communicating with a sociologist academic who actually learned how to be a wealth manager and learned all these tricks. She wrote a book called Offshore. And
Brooke Harrington.
Brooke Harrington, and she was on Jon Stewart Daily Show on Monday, and I was just literally exchanging emails with her during this session right now, related to bringing more media to our event in April, where she's going to participate in a panel with, Gary Kelman from Transparency International US and others. And I want to bring my discipline, I'm a finance professor, to an understanding of these issues because they are completely blind to them. So I think part of the problem here, as I see it from my academic venue, is that academics and others are not connecting the dots on what you're doing and not helping you as much as we can. But I think people like Brooke Harrington and a few other academics who talk about the role of lawyers, like, Alexander Cooley from Bernard and other people, can help and should help more. And that's what I intend to do, which is why I've become more involved in your kind of organization. I donate to your kind of organization, very small money. But, I think what you do is very important. And I wanted to express that, the desire to help bring more collaborations across, professions beyond the media.
Fantastic.
That's great to hear. So,
if I may, I've just mentioned briefly, and I Googled you and your work whilst you were talking. You do so much that is remarkably relevant to the work of the Transparency Task Force. So I'm especially pleased that you're here. Frederick, I interrupted you as you were about to say something. Please do carry on. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank. That's really great to hear. But I think I do already see the silver lining on the horizon, because actually, Brooke Harrington that you mentioned, she was one of the few academics that could help us already when we investigated the Panama Papers, because she already had that knowledge. And if I do basically see what happened since in academia, there's more and more academics looking into this field, like learning what they have missed in the past. And I think that's good to hear. I agree with you, it's not enough yet. But hearing about your conference, that seems like one of an amazing, hopefully many amazing steps forward.
I'll put a link in the chat. We're literally just inviting people, and I actually want more journalists there. Precisely. In fact, Brooke wrote to me specifically saying, should we promote the conference more? Should we get more media in there so they can write about it? So it's really to your point about sharing and about the problem being very global and enablers and all of that. We're going to discuss this right away in the conference. So I'll put in the chat, or I can send you later a link to the conference. I'm literally just doing invitations for it, but for Zoom, it's open to everybody. I just don't have money to invite all of you there from wherever you are.
We will have many people who will want to come along to that. We've got hands up from Declan, from Frank, and from Trevor. Declan Egan, please introduce yourself and share your thought. Thank you. Take yourself off mute, sir. You just need to unmute with the... look for the microphone icon at the bottom left of your Zoom screen, Declan. And if you can't, we'll quickly go to Frank Jovanovic. Yeah, let's go to Frank whilst Declan's sorting himself out. Frank, please introduce yourself. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. I'm Frank Jovanovic, professor of economics and finance in a distance learning university in Quebec. And I'm very interested by such a subject. And just some comment, there's one point because I'm thinking how we can educate the new generation about such kind of things. And the fact that right now the Panama Papers, the data are not accessible for the student is difficult because, it could be a very good thing to help them to train on the real case, on the real data. And that's something that I remember I approached some of the journalists and they said, yeah, but we need to protect and so on. I totally understand that. Maybe it could be great for some people who are interested to how we can investigate in real data just to have access to part of them. Just an idea, And also there's something that I just observed is there's something very interesting regarding one of your answers, how the fact that you share the information. And that's very important, sharing. But it's also, we have to educate people, but in my opinion, in order to have to educate the new generation, we need to have a cross-country education. Because when we stay in our bubble, in our country, of course, regulations are not the same, are different in different countries, but also what transparency is. I grew up in France, so I know in Europe, I was in the UK, in Canada, but we don't have the same conception of what is the transparency. And that's very important, I think, because with the Panama paper, we could see that we have a common problem. And if such kind of problem is just investigated by one country, of course, we will have some, I would say, BAs, education BAs and also cultural BAs. And the fact that we have something very cross-cultural country that help to take distance and to understand what transparency, the need for transparency and so on. That's very interesting because, for instance, Canada, we don't have a lot of transparency, but we believe that we have a lot of transparency. We are so good, but we don't have. And when we have this kind of investigation, we understand, whoa, we have something hidden in our education and perspective. So thank you so much, and thank you for your work.
And I think that's something where Canada has a lot in common with Germany. Germany is always thinking and pretending that we are super transparent and that we are not corrupt. The corrupt are always the others, and we are missing the fact, for example, that currently 2 former MPs are facing trial because they allegedly have been bribed by the Azerbaijani government to basically vote in their favor. And we don't have a public UBO register. We don't have a public real estate register. But I also agree with your point when it comes to the frustration of academia of not being able to access the Panama Papers. And I put it in the chat here that ICJ recently launched an API to basically enable more research also from academia than they had in the past. It's still, and there's a huge disclaimer, it's still not the original document, it's the structured document. But I think it's already a huge step forward in comparison to like 5 years ago.
Very good progress. Very good questions. Thank you very much, Frederick, and everybody. We'll go to Declan again. Declan, can you unmute yourself, please? Yes.
Hi, Andy. Thank you. Firstly, just like to say, Frederick, thank you so much for making this presentation and answering questions. It's just brilliant to have it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Just quickly to lead into my question, I'm a chartered accountant in practice. I worked in industry for many years, went into practice about 25 years ago. Because I was in the courts for the last 10 years approximately, my eyes started opening up in all sorts of areas, particularly financial, legal, etc. And I've learned more about money and finance in the last 10 years than I have in the previous 45 years. What's occurred to me from numerous points of view is that big is not beautiful. And as a result, you can have regulations and rules all over the place. But if you've got big corporations, big setups like the EU, big setups like the World Health Organization, like the United Nations, they're always going to be so far distanced from accountability and responsibility that it makes it very hard to ensure they're run the way they used to be. I never realized Germany was broken up into so many different states the way the United States is, and particularly with regard to credit unions, that they had their own local banks in all of those states and had hundreds of them, which are very like credit unions, which were set up in Ireland by John Hume, who passed away just in recent years, who would be shocked to now know that they've basically been captured by the banks. And it's just an example of, if things get big, then control is taken away. Actually, small and community allows accountability and responsibility. So it's a long meandering question into, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on it.
I think my first thought when you started to introduce yourself was like, we need more individuals as you helping journalists and helping journalists to understand what we are investigating, because that's really a struggle. And that whenever we start a new project, it's really hard to find experts. You mostly find experts who are very outgoing and are pretending that they know a lot. But those ones who really worked in the field for years and who know all the tricks that the crooks are sometimes using, those are the ones that we as journalists are always desperately searching for. Because I think also in this field, we have to better combine forces. I think even in this like conversation here, I hear already there's academia, there's experts like you, there's me as a journalist, and I think we all need to team up and to help each other. So that's, for example, something that in the Anti-Corruption Data Collective we are trying. That's basically a group where we are trying to bring together journalists, programmers, advocacy groups, and academia. And we also want to address the problem that academia sometimes faces, the challenge of not having enough data to work with. But on the other hand side, there is groups who know where the data is, because there's enough data out there. You only have to search for it. The times are over where I have to wait for a whistleblower to come to me. If I know where to search, I can find it easily, especially if I'm not focused on one specific aspect, one specific company. So there's a lot out there, and there's still a lot of work that we can all do together.
Thank you. Thank you.
There is a huge amount of potential through these kinds of collaborations. I am genuinely excited by what I'm hearing this evening, because I'm feeling there is the possibility of dragging the truth to the surface. Frederick, without going into any inappropriate detail, there are probably 3 or 4 or 5 major scandals and frauds that we know are real, that we have so far been unable to drag to the surface, frankly, because they are so big and so significant, the vested interests that would become uncomfortable with the truth getting into the open are continuing to do all they can to suppress the truth. But we will speak further, Frederick, about this, because the combination of the academics, the investigative reporter, you are like a detective, really, hey, the activists, the subject matter experts, the reformed bankers, the reformed accountants who have gone to the light side from the dark side. This combination of people is exactly the cocktail that is necessary to make the magic happen. You are making me think of the fire triangle. When we are young, we learn that you cannot have fire without fuel, oxygen, and a heat source, I think it is. Fuel, oxygen, heat. Similarly here, we cannot get the truth into the open unless we have that combination of different skill sets. And this is what you've just spoken to. And I genuinely believe we can help you find more interesting stories to investigate. More about that later, Frederick. We'll speak further. Meanwhile, let us go to Trevor Meelan. Trevor, keep it short for me, nice and succinct, and please do share your point. Trevor, by the way, folks, is somebody who literally helps people to have their homes repossessed through banks.
Stops repossession.
Stops repossession when banks are acting unlawfully and abusing their powers and their abuse and exploitation of the court systems. So Trevor is one of the many heroes in our community that is actively trying to help people at a human level. Trevor, over to you. Thank you very much.
Hi, Frederick. Thanks for coming on. My question to you, I get a load of victims. I had another one today come to me, another Lloyd's victim. I'm also a Lloyd's bank victim, a business victim, Lloyd's BSU, Bristol. I've had loads of victims come to me where their money runs out and they can't afford the lawyers and so on. We try and help them best we can with their court papers and so on. My background was state agency, and I also had 10 years where I was an industry stakeholder advisor to government on property fraud, money laundering. Now, I work in a dad's army team. It's a small number of us. So we've got ex-police lawyer, we've got Nigel Harper, we do bits with Anthony, Dave Latey, and so on. But when you were doing the Panama Papers, the IT issues you had then compared to what you could do now, because we've got about 30,000, 35,000 documents of victims, which I'm working on one at the moment, which shows a lot of the lies that they use in court. And what I want to do, I want to find a database situation where we can start feeding all the documents in OCR. And then what I want to do, some people do get settlements, but mainly out of court. Now, some of those people might lend their paperwork anonymously. And then we can look at the acts, the law. I've been playing a little bit with AI, which I find quite good for finding bits of law and so on. And what I think is most bank fraud victims' cases, nobody's got 100% of the pieces of the puzzle. So some people might have 20% of the picture box. Some people might have 70, 80%. No one's got the whole lot. But what we're finding is that a lot of corrupt police, a lot of corrupt regulators, solicitors are on systemically on these cases. So what would your advice be as to how it was when you said we need a computer system? What were the hiccups, the learning curves? How would you do that today? And have you any idea of sort of costings or capabilities to build such a system?
Well, when we started the Panama Papers, we basically had a two different systems. One was a commercial solution that was working on an air-gapped computer that was not connected to the internet, that it was only affordable because it was donated basically by the company to us. But the other system that we worked on was like a system that was created by ICIJ that's called Data Share. And it's open source. I can put the link in here. So if you have some tech-savvy individuals in your group, that's quite easy, I was told, because I'm not that tech-savvy. It's quite easy to set up on your own computer. You can basically invite others to share data with you. It's OCRing, it's included, so it has a good search engine. So that is basically where I would start. Or another solution is that's also open source is Aleph. That is an open source solution that the Organized Crime and Corruption reporting project is using.
Can you spell that, please?
I'll put it in the chat.
This is wonderfully helpful, Frederick. Thank you.
And that's what me and my colleagues also use. Those are both systems that work quite well. It's non-commercial, it's open source, but you need somebody like a little bit tech savvy to help you set it up. But as soon as it's set up, it's quite easy to use.
And do you see AI becoming useful to look at databases to cross-search?
Yes, it's getting more and more important. So during I think there was the Panama Papers at ICIJ, we tried it for the first time. At that point in time, it was not that super helpful. But I mean, since that, in the times of AI, decades have passed, so it's getting better and better. So I think it's only a question of time till AI is helping us to analyze huge data sets, speaking here in terms of like terabytes of data, connecting the dots, or even if it were only to help us cross-matching with lists of politically exposed persons. So I think we are on the right track, but we are still not there. I have not seen a system yet that is like the holy grail when it comes to analyzing big amounts of data and searching for stories in the public interest.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you very much indeed, Trevor. You're wonderfully helpful, Frederick. You have a natural inclination to share it with a nothing expected in return mindset, which is truly commendable. If I may, I'd like to take the conversation somewhere quite specific. You touched on oligarchs earlier. I am becoming, as many people are, I am becoming increasingly worried about the quality of democracy around the world. I am becoming increasingly worried that the people who get into power in politics are people who have the funding from vested interests that they subsequently become in some way indebted to and need to repay through favors of one kind or another. I am becoming increasingly concerned and worried that fewer and fewer democracies are untouched by a kind of election funding corruption that seems to be taking place. I'm becoming increasingly worried that the distance between the ordinary people and the state is getting further and further away. There's a lot I am genuinely becoming very, very concerned about. And you touched on the point earlier, Frederick, that it's been disappointing that the debates that should be happening amongst the politicians and the heads of the different jurisdictions about what to do to stamp out corruption hasn't really been happening. And in the UK, as you know, we are a world centre for illicit money flows. We specialise in the UK at dodgy money, perhaps because of our colonial past and all those offshore jurisdictions, etc., etc., etc. And you spoke in one of your slides, Frederick, about all of the enablers. The harsh reality is that the kind of people who are in the Panama Papers are the kinds of people who hire the top accountants, the top lawyers, the top trust companies. They spend a fortune on their services. Those companies and organizations in turn support politicians and other vested interests. And we have an unhealthy relationship between the virtues of truth and transparency and accountability and the power being sucked into a relatively small number of people with a disproportionate amount of power and influence who have a selfish agenda to maintain or increase their own levels of wealth and influence and power in the world. And I'm seeing our society heading towards a very, very bleak future. And it's really genuinely worrying me, Frederick. And I realize my question is turning into a bit of a rant. Perhaps I'm getting this off my chest. Am I right to be concerned about the way things are going, I guess is what I'm saying. Do you see the world as being as full of corruption as I am now starting to see it, and have become seeing it in recent years since becoming an activist campaigner? Because it seems to me that there is a lot of corruption out there, and it's difficult to know what to do about it, Frederick. Thank you.
Oh, that's a hard one, because of course, especially in this week, it's difficult to always keep like optimism. I nevertheless would try it, because I do see, I think sometimes there's problems where we don't have a solution. Imagine illnesses like HIV, where we still don't have a remedy. About what we speak here, we have a remedy, but we are not using it. We have the remedy in like transparency, and some of the like different aspects of transparency I've already mentioned, like the different registers. We are not applying it, we are not using it. So that still is like dark in a way, but it makes me feel optimistic, because we only have to take that little step to take our remedy. We don't have to invent it. It's already invented. We are not using it. So I think, and that's something that we as a society can learn, and that we can easily learn. It will not take like decades to apply this remedy. That's a question, if we want, of some month. Well, let's say in some countries where lawmakers are working a little bit slower, maybe years, but it's not decades. So that's why I would really hope for at least one advantage of those dark times where oligarchs are getting more and more power and abusing power, in my opinion. There's like, we may learn our lesson, how we can like help to prevent this happen again, or at least how we can hold those oligarchs accountable for what they're doing now.
Your optimism is reassuring, Frederick, and I'm grateful to you for it. As you were speaking, I started to think about, wouldn't it be wonderful if that we could somehow create a true international network of progressives who bought into the principles of transparency and accountability and scrutiny and the kind of work that you do. Maybe the way forward is to find a way for everybody on the light side to learn how to collaborate better. I think that what you did with Panama Papers was quite a paradigm shift. The way that you use the power of collaboration and sharing, I think, shows us the way forward. And that's about connecting people, communicating in a trustworthy way, and enabling everybody to play their little part in making the big outcome that we all want to achieve happen. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Folks, I've got a few thoughts I'd like to close with in a moment or two, but I'm going to go to Frederick in a short while to ask for his final comments. But before we go to Frederick for his final comments, does anybody have anything else they are itching to share? It's been fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I hope you all have as well. Please raise your hand if you do. I'm looking through my list of attendees to see if anybody would like to. I think we're going back to Mark Bannister. After Mark, we'll go to Frederick Obermeyer, for whom we are very grateful for being with tonight. Mark Bannister, thank you.
Thank you again, Frederick, for sharing your comments and your observations. I have one particularly prescient one, and it stems from where the Panama Papers came from, Panama. and indeed all the offshore havens. Why is it, do you think, that we tolerate offshore havens? What on earth, as nation states, are we doing? We see America moving towards protectionism under both administrations. Trump has come into power and has told NATO that it expects it to afford its own defense, as indeed I think we should. Sad to say that we should need such an organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So irrespective of the political position, be it left or right, although when it comes to money, it all seems to be very self-orientated. But on that basis, why are there Panamas? Why are there Virgin Islands? Why are there Guernsey and Jersey? Why do we tolerate this?
I think one of the reasons is because we, meaning we as journalists, but also I think teachers are not teaching enough and telling enough and explaining enough why all those very technical topics, all those jurisdictions that sometimes seem very far away from us and from our daily lives, how they affect our daily lives on a daily basis. If we in Germany don't have enough money to basically have a proper healthcare, that's because of secrecy jurisdictions. If your universities are broken and some people can't afford cannot afford anymore to go to universities, that's because of secrecy jurisdictions. When some countries are basically plundered, that's due to secrecy jurisdictions. When inequality is getting higher and higher, that's due to secrecy jurisdictions. When we see the richest turning into super riches because they're not taxed enough or in a fair way, that's due to secrecy jurisdictions. But I think that connection is not communicated enough. We are seeing it like in a very technical way still. Like if you speak to people on Main Street about secrecy jurisdiction and why it's good to get rid of bearer shares, that's like, whoa, people will run away when they hear the word bearer shares. But when you explain to them that those are used by crooks and criminals to basically hand over monies without a proper trail, and these are a huge problem for law enforcement to get rid of drug cartels, then they will understand a little bit more. And I think we have to explain this again and again and again in a very non-technical tone. And I think that is what we failed. And I think that's also some parts of the special interest press, I don't know the proper English term, like the Wall Street Journal, the Economists, they have to tell it as well. They have to tell it to their audience. I have to tell it to my audience. And I think we should also try to find a way of telling it to students, telling it to children. When I tried to explain it to my kid when he was 5 or 6 years old, I found a way of explaining him what a shell company is. But I think this is something that we have to incorporate into how to educate us, the younger ones and the elderly as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I would also just point this to Professor Anat and Matti. I'm sorry, I probably butchered your name, but forgive me. Andy knows this. I ceaselessly bang on to everybody who will listen that there is no money. People don't understand there is no money. That in fact money is shirt tokens. It's whatever you want it to believe, and we need this level of understanding, and then we will get somewhere. But until we have a level of education that people actually understand the issues that they're broadly dealing with, then we're having like a shadow game where we're all saying it's outrageous and it's unsatisfactory, but we're not moving directly to the points that will change it. And in that regard, I have interest in your commentary around bearer bearer shares, all of which I support. But then you can make the arguments that central depository exchanges, which is where everything is moved to tokenization, which is in fact the reality today. It's like everybody in this room who owns their house that they're currently sitting in believe they own their house. In fact, they don't own their house. They only think they own their house because the representation of ownership is controlled through the land registry, and the land registry is able to be abused and indeed is done by our financial system and the banks and the government. So there's a whole raft, a plethora of issues that we can address, but we need to educate people around them so that we can get to these core fundamental issues, and then from there create a system that is much more open because it is understood.
Mark, thank you. Let's go to Frederick for his final words before I close tonight's conversation. Frederick, back to you, sir, for your final comments, if any. Thank you.
Well, I simply want to say thank you for listening to me for this discussion. And I think, getting back to you, Andy, I think we are living in dark times, but I really try to be optimistic, because I really believe from my heart that a better world is possible. And I think we can all do our work. And I think you're doing your work with organizing evenings like this. I think hearing of that conference in Stanford sounds amazing. So I think we should all find our own format, our part of daily life, how we can educate our neighbors, our friends, and thereby making the world a better place. Thank you.
Frederick, thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to share one slide to help close tonight's conversation. Some of you have seen me talk about this many times before. It's a comment from Robert F. Kennedy, obviously back in the 60s. To me, this statement, this quote, captures so many important things. And it's fundamentally about the idea of standing up rather than standing by, speaking out rather than being silent, protesting instead of accepting the status quo when we know it to be wrong. Robert F. Kennedy, back in the 60s, said, "Every time we turn our heads the other way, when we see the law flouted, when we tolerate what we know to be wrong, when we close our eyes and ears to the corrupt because we are too busy or too frightened, when we fail to speak up and speak out, we strike a blow against freedom and decency and justice." I believe all that to be completely true today as it was back in the 1960s. Frederick, you've brought us encouragement, optimism, a sense of belief about the possibilities of the world becoming a better place. It does all revolve around the idea. It can be expressed in many ways. One of the ways of expressing it is sunlight is the best disinfectant. What you and your colleagues did, sir, was a massive contribution to making the world a better place. I'm sure you must be rightly very, very proud of everything that you and your colleagues did, not just the wisdom to actually have the guts to push forward with it, but also to have the vision about how to do it by bringing everybody together, working collaboratively, sharing data. It's as if you were guided by wise souls within yourselves to make it happen that way, because you went about it brilliantly. It's only because you went about it so brilliantly that it was the incredible success that it has been. Frederick, we are all indebted to you and your colleagues. We would like to thank you very much indeed for being with us tonight, for everything you've done, no doubt everything you're currently doing, and everything you'll do in the future. You are a hero to the cause of transparency. Frederick, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Please show our appreciation.
Thanks for having me.
You are very welcome. You are very welcome. We'll follow up on a few things that have come up tonight. There's lots to talk about. Thanks, Frederick. Thank you all. Good night. Good night.